The interesting thing about that term, LDS scholar, is it suggests there's something unique about being an LDS scholar as opposed to some other. And there is. I think, as I would characterize that term, I see a combination of spirit and reason that make what we might call an LDS scholar. And first of all, I didn't know that such a thing could exist earlier in my life. But it's interesting that it was reason that introduced me to spirit. I grew up without any religion in my life at all, formally. My grandparents were all Russian Jews who immigrated here early 20th century to avoid the pogroms, to escape the pogroms. And they're very fiddler on the roof people, and they were. But there was no religion practiced in my home. We were a long way from any other Jewish community, and so I grew up without ever going to formal church meetings, synagogue meetings, training, or any of that sort of thing. One set of grandparents whom I saw infrequently, but maybe once or twice a year, were closer to Orthodox. And so I was exposed to Passover meal every year, things like that. But it really wasn't part of me. But as I attended my undergraduate university training in the sciences at the University of California, Berkeley, in the 60s, by the way, the things that I was learning about our universe, our physical world, and its genius actually inspired me. And in spite of the prevailing ideology of the day, which was that given enough time, anything will happen by chance, I just couldn't accept that. And it just seemed that there was a genius behind our world and our universe. And I awakened to that as a beginning and said, there's something there. But it was not a formal awakening, but it was reason leading me toward spirit. So that beginning. In graduate school, I met my wife, who was born and raised as a very devout Protestant. And she was, if they would ever use the term active the way we use it, she was very active. She attended church every Sunday. Actually, most churches don't require much more than that, but she did that and had gone to a parochial high school and had paraphrased the entire Bible from Genesis 1 through Revelation, and was serious about it. And that was a surprise to me. So I eventually ended up, as our relationship went further, taking lessons from her pastor there at the university in Madison, Wisconsin, and ended up also reading the New Testament for the first time. But the things I learned were not connecting here. Without the restoration, there are huge holes in Christian doctrine. And I met wonderful people. They were wonderful people, very faithful people, but who, in my judgment, had to compartmentalize their life. Reason dictated most of their life. Spirit was something they alluded to and immersed themselves in for short periods of time every week, but they didn't know how to bring them together because of the huge lapses in doctrinal issues that didn't make sense. And so spirit and reason seemed to be chasms apart. And yet I had an experience with the New Testament that suggested by spirit that something happened 2,000 years ago. And so there we were when the LDS missionaries knocked on our door, started to teach us, with great reluctance from my wife, by the way. And she admits that. But one of the early discussions, which I don't even remember, ended with the missionaries asking if I had any questions. Well, my experience with some of these big questions that I didn't see answers to when I was being taught by my wife's pastor was that in many cases he didn't even understand the question, in the sense that it didn't need to make sense, so why is there a problem? And so with these LDS missionaries asking, well, do you have any questions? I decided it was time to just see if this was going to be a fruitful relationship at all, and let's start with one of those. And as I began to ask one of those major questions, one of the missionaries answered or finished the question for me. And I was surprised, and I said, yeah, do you have an answer? And he had told us already there were going to be 7 discussions, and he said, yeah, but that's not until the 5th discussion. And I almost threw him out the 3rd floor window. But that was the beginning of my sensing that these missionaries were more tuned in to reason and spirit combined, that they were going to be able to answer questions, and in fact eventually did. Would there be spirit? Would it only be reason? Well, we learned something about that as well. The 2 missionaries that ended up teaching us the most were a split between what was then a stake missionary, a local man, family man, in his late 30s, I would judge, and a full-time 20-year-old missionary from Provo, Utah. And the stake missionary was an interesting, fairly intense brother who was very knowledgeable and successfully tried to be very spiritual. And so one of the early discussions that we had was not actually among the lessons that they formally had from the mission president's office, but was something he learned from his mission president, who was Alvin R. Dyer. And it basically was based on Alma 32. And the missionaries explained what Alma was trying to teach about faith and reason and knowledge. And as they did, of course, they tried to explain what Alma was trying to describe when he described feeling spiritual responses. And of course, for those of us who had not had that kind of experience at least identified, it was hard for me to separate that from, in fact, what I told them was, it sounds like you're trying to talk yourself into something. And they said, no, it's different. And we went back and forth. We didn't know they had a curfew. This discussion, I think, ended about 1 in the morning. And finally, the stake missionary, and they realized that we'd reached a point of no progress, and they decided it was time to leave. And finally, the stake missionary, who was very intense in the way that he also made his points, he would always point his finger when it was something he really wanted me to pay attention to, us to pay attention to, my wife and I both. And he said, okay, I can't explain it to you, but the things that we tell you are going to seem strangely familiar, and you're going to know that they're true. You're going to know it. We said, yeah, okay. The other part of that discussion that I think I should mention was that as part of Alma's description of the Lord answering prayer, I had a response to that in my mind, which was reason and spirit, because I had already experienced the fact that there were many religions in the world and doctrines and proponents and antagonists, and especially if you don't believe that your observations are going to be able to sort all of that out, I thought it makes sense that if there is a God, and that's the stage I was at the time, formally, if there is a God and he really wants me to know something, like he's restored his church, as the missionaries were trying to tell us, he would know that we couldn't figure that out on our own. And that the only way we would know would be that if he told us. And that made sense. Kind of a combination of reason and spirit together. But the other reaction I had was, in my worldly point of view, it was preposterous to think that God would actually talk to man. I mean, they put people in jail or in asylums who say that. And so I didn't think that was possible. But nevertheless, we had that discussion, and it ended very late at night with the stake missionary making that promise. And so we went on for the third discussion, fourth discussion. And then as part of that, as we progressed through that, I and my wife both were given assignments by the missionaries. Missionaries know how to do that. Would you read these verses of Scripture before we come next time? And we were students. I was a graduate student. My wife was finishing her undergraduate program, and we would politely agree, at least in the moment, that we'd try to do that. And the other thing they would ask us to do is pray about it, and they taught us how to go through the steps of prayer. And we reluctantly, but positively did say, yes, we would do that, especially since I had this experience where I said, that makes sense. So if I'm going to conduct this experiment, I can't say that I know the answers, the results of the experiment, unless I conduct it. Reason and spirit. And so we went on through these discussions, and the missionaries would ask each time, did you read the things we asked you to read? Did you pray about the things we asked you to pray about? And the answer was usually no, we hadn't done that. And so I started feeling guilty, and one Saturday morning, I think, I felt sufficiently guilty to say, all right, I promised I would read, I promised I would pray. So I sat down and I began reading the Book of Mormon. Nephi chapter 1, verse 1. I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, and on, and read for probably an hour and a half. And I remember my wife, as she'd been going about her various activities, walked by in one particular moment in our little third-floor apartment bedroom, living room where I was sitting. And I looked up at her and I said, I don't know what else is true, but that young man didn't make up this book. But I didn't think much more about that. The other thing that happened during that time was that I did pray for the first time in my life. I waited till my wife wasn't home. This is a very embarrassing and intimidating kind of an experience. In fact, so much so that we had 2 cats, and I even locked them out of the room. But I did offer a prayer, and it was probably one of the most sincere prayers I've ever offered. And it was basically, Father in heaven, because that's what I was being taught to say, if you're there, and if this is your church, I will do what you asked me to do. Nothing happened. Moroni didn't appear in my bedroom. No light appeared, but I did have that experience while I was reading, but didn't think much more about it. And so the discussions came and went until the night of the 5th discussion. The 5th discussion was about the plan of salvation. And in those days, the missionaries used flannel boards and paper pictures, which I learned later They borrowed from a primary teacher who developed the system in Orem, Utah, in the ward that I lived in, and I later called her to be my Relief Society president. But, getting way ahead of myself, the diagram that the missionaries developed as they told us about the plan of salvation was with a premortal world and a veil of forgetfulness and an earth and a spirit world and then 3 degrees of glory. And as my wife and I listened and watched and observed, participated to whatever degree we did and read verses we were asked to read and so forth, during that whole time, that evening, we both knew that what they were telling us was true. Not like we were hearing it for the first time. It was like we were helping them practice. And we didn't say anything to each other. We didn't say anything to them to indicate that, although apparently the way we responded was enough of an indication that we learned later from the missionaries that after they walked out of our apartment door, they turned to each other and shook hands and floated to their car. So, but they didn't challenge us to baptism that night. And I believe we would not have been ready. And so they came back and taught us the 6th discussion, and then came back and taught us the 7th discussion, and then came back on a hot day for some lemonade, and came back for another day to show us a film strip, and came back to stand in front of our air conditioner, and came back for every excuse they could think to come back, and still didn't challenge us to baptism. One night, after this had been going on for a while, I said to my wife, what are we going to do about these crazy Mormons? Because if this thing is true, it's the biggest thing in the last 2,000 years. Why isn't it on the 6 o'clock news? Why isn't it on the headlines of every major newspaper? When that's not the case, there's usually a catch. There's got to be a catch. Well, I wonder who we could ask about whether there's a catch. Well, we've got this Protestant minister that we knew, and in fact helped perform our wedding by that time. We had been married now for a year. And so I'll call this minister and ask him if there's anything that he knows that's wrong with the Mormons. Well, most Latter-day Saints are pretty aware of what kind of response that might have elicited. And fortunately, the Lord was aware as well, because I picked up the phone, I dialed the phone number, I got a teenage son on the phone who said his father was not home. No, he didn't know when he would be back, but it was 9:30 at night or so, and clearly he wasn't going to be out much later. I'll just call back. Hung up the phone. Before I even took my hand off the phone, our doorbell rang. Went down and answered the phone. Our front door was a stairway down. Answered the door, and there stood 2 missionaries, our 2 missionaries. And they came in, sat down. We sat down. It was the night before my wife's final exam, so she was still paging through her biochemistry notes. And they were asking such relevant questions as, how are you? We're fine, how are you? And finally I said, what can I do for you? And the stake missionary raised his finger and said, we don't know why we're here. You tell us. And the Spirit bore witness to me that this was not a forgery. This was not a dramatic play, that if this had been a test, they would have failed it. That is, if it had been an artificial test. But that this was who they were and that the Lord had sent them. And so I told them why, and I knew at that moment, I knew why. I said, it's because I just made a phone call. That's why you're here. And then they proceeded to explain to both of my wife and I what had happened the night of the 5th discussion. and that we had received an answer to prayer. And that was the beginning of our journey as LDS scholars. And we did accept their challenge to baptism that night. And so that was the beginning of knowing, okay, reason, understanding, a plan of salvation that resonates both here and here. And a purpose, a God with a purpose that resonates both here and here. And so that was the beginning. The next chapter, I guess, in becoming LDS scholars was coming to BYU. Because of all places on the earth, this is the perfect place to combine reason and spirit. Now, I didn't know that. I didn't know that even after we joined the church. We were sealed in one of the Provo temples the year after we joined the church, and did walk on the BYU campus, guided by that full-time missionary from Provo, Utah, who'd returned home, but hadn't thought much about it since. And now, 3 years after that, we were finishing a postdoctoral position and wondering what we should do next, and BYU is not in my mind at all. And yet, for various reasons, knelt one early morning and asked the Lord where he wanted me to go, because my conversion was at the point where I wanted to be where he wanted me to be. And one of those defining moments, I don't pretend that this happens often, but in one of those defining moments, I very distinctly heard or felt the voice of the Lord say, BYU. And I was both shocked because I hadn't considered it, and contemplative about the possibility, and struggled with it because we loved doing missionary work by that time and had some positive experiences doing missionary work. Had friends join the church or become reactivated because, well, not because, but certainly in association with our getting to know them and sharing our testimonies with them and encouraging them. And so coming to Utah and working at BYU wasn't what was on our mind first. But as I prayed about it more and thought about it more, the possibilities began to develop in my mind, where I began to understand why that the Lord might want me to come here. And not knowing exactly what the climate was like here, but knowing how I might feel working for the Lord rather than for any other employer sounded like a great idea. The only problem was I knew that now, and the Lord knew that, but BYU didn't know that. And so I picked up the phone in the middle of the summer of 1976, called down to the university, asked. I had learned that they had a chemical engineering department, so I asked for that department. Secretary answered the phone, young lady that I still remember, and I asked her what the name of the department chair was, and she told me. And I said, by any chance, could he talk to me on the phone? And I said, and she said, yes, just a minute. And about 30 seconds later, a voice came on the phone, and I explained to him who I was and that I was looking for a job. And he began to ask me questions about where I'd gone to college, both undergraduate and graduate school, and who I'd worked for in my graduate work, and what my research area interests were, and all these different questions. And at the end of, and while I was answering all of those, I'm thinking to myself, he's got to think I'm some kind of crazy person, because you don't apply for a job this way. But when we finished answering the question answer part of the discussion, he paused for a moment, and he said, it's really funny you should call right now. We just made a decision to hire somebody that we wanted to hire somebody in your research area. And 3 months later, I was here. And that's fast for BYU. So that was the beginning, again, of spirit and reason coming together here. But I think I began to understand that opportunity first when I attended my very first university conference that fall of 1976. I had been at 2 major universities for my own education and in a postdoctoral situation, and in none of them was there really a preponderance of spirit in classroom or otherwise. In fact, in the postdoctoral position I've been in, there had been some rather uncomfortable and undesirable kinds of elements in the relationships with some manipulation and backbiting and those kinds of things. And so coming from that postdoctoral experience and now walking into the Marriott Center with 2,000 to 3,000 people, all employees of the university, faculty, staff, administrators, and we began with an LDS hymn and a prayer, and it felt very different and very good. And I began to sense that this is a place where we do the work of the university, but we do it in the context and under the banner and under the influence of the Spirit. Of course, I learned more later about Carl G. Mazur and Brigham Young saying to Brother Mazur, don't even teach the multiplication tables without the Spirit. So that was my introduction to Spirit and reason coming together at BYU, and that beginning of that chapter of my LDS scholar journey. So how does that play? How did it play for me? It played in a couple of arenas while here. One had to do with my research activities and my research interactions, not only with students but with colleagues, and just the struggles of doing experimental work and publishing papers, getting grants. And of course, one element of that, which I don't believe is totally unique to BYU, but good people everywhere, I think, are benefited by the light of Christ. And I think our Father in heaven illuminates our efforts if we're doing things that further his purposes, even if we don't know we are. And I can say that there were times when I felt like I was being aided in my work, and I was grateful for that, and that certainly is one component of being an LDS scholar. But one that I thought was maybe even more interesting was, like in any professional area, there's a community. One has colleagues, and it can be in any kind of professional area, whether it be blue collar, white collar, whatever. You have a community of colleagues with whom you associate. And you have the opportunity in that community to influence your colleagues because you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they soon come to know that. In fact, as Latter-day Saints, we try to make sure they know that. And that was very much true in my professional, scholarly interactions with my colleagues. Even if I didn't mention it to them, the fact that I was from Brigham Young University spoke volumes. And if there was any question, it often led to a colleague asking me, well, then are you a Mormon? And I could reply in the affirmative, and that would sometimes lead to discussions that allowed me to share as much as the situation allowed. And so that was a very positive part of being an LDS scholar, is that I'm a scholar who has faith. And there were other wonderful colleagues who had faith as well, even if not LDS. And I found that in some group settings, often when I would make a comment that drew upon the spiritual part of my being, one or two of my colleagues of faith would chime in with their agreement and their support and their gratitude that I spoke up. So that's certainly a gratifying part of the journey as an LDS scholar. But and that was as I said, gratifying. But I think where I found the journey to be the most impactful for me on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis was in my interaction with my students and in the teaching component of what we do here. One of the reasons for that is I sensed very early, partly because of the story of how we had come here, but also in my very first interactions with students, I sensed that BYU students are, and I'm going to say hungry, for examples of how you can be an educated, successful professional, and whatever that meant because of the choice of major and journey that they were on, and at the same time a faithful Latter-day Saint. How do you combine faith and reason? And I believe that LDS and BYU students really want examples of that in their lives and are looking for it, and that they come to BYU for a number of reasons, and that's one of them. And I felt like that was part of my mission for coming here. And so that's been part of that journey, and the way I've tried to fulfill that mission, both collectively and individually, is that, well, collectively in the classroom, first of all, by the way I treated the students, I tried to represent someone who is a Latter-day Saint in, I hope, deed as well as word, and that I treated them not only cordially, but with charity, and that with my policies I erred on the side of charity. But that also, when we had a moment in class, whether prompted by something we were talking about in class, or simply because there were a few extra minutes at the end of what I wanted to talk about before the bell had rung, I would say something to them about the gospel. I would share a spiritual thought, an encouragement. And I didn't, at first I thought I might try to connect it with what we've been talking about, but I found I didn't need to. I could say, before you go, I've just been thinking about you and thinking about something that I feel strongly about. Can I share it with you? And I found from the very beginning, students were very grateful for that. And that collective effort was appreciated and was effective for them. As many expressed that really helped me. I really needed to hear that. I needed to hear it from you. The other thing that I felt was part of that mission to help them bring faith and reason together was to come to know them personally. And so, starting very early in my tenure here, I began learning my students' names. And even before we had the university providing picture class roles for us, I would take pictures of the students on the first day of class. They probably thought that I was lining them up for some kind of a criminal investigation, but I learned their names, and they appreciated that very much. And that led to being able to talk to them more personally. And I learned a little bit about them and had them fill out information sheets and found out where they were from and where they'd gone on their missions and other things they were interested in. And sometimes they would ask questions of me on the personal information sheet, and I would refer to it. And that was a wonderful beginning to friendships that led to them, to students more than a few times, coming to my office to talk, even when it wasn't about the class, and asking my advice or concern. And that has led to some wonderful experiences. The opportunity sometimes would come because I had asked a student who was struggling to come in and talk to me. And I could provide some support, some help, not only in the way of counsel, but even marshaling university resources when that was merited to the counseling center or other places, and could get involved in helping them when they struggled. Sometimes it was even more personal and more short-term than that. And a very treasured opportunity was some of those moments when a student asked me for a priesthood blessing. And I felt honored to give that priesthood blessing, and felt like it was once again bringing together what was, in the world's terms, academic and reason with spirit, and that they're not separable. It's been very gratifying. Among the gratifying elements of this journey have been a number of circumstances in which some of my former students have come back to the university as new faculty members. And I've been very pleased that they have expressed to me their desire and have shown me by example that they want to do some of the same things that they learned from me about how they treat students here at BYU. So those are some of the elements of being an LDS scholar in my take on that term and in my application of the concept.